So I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Barbara Alpern-Engel of University of Colorado, who's had a long, illustrious career. And Barbara's title today is Three Merchants Who Longed for Love and How They Fared, Stories of Sentiment from Marriage, Household, and Home in Modern Russia. And our subsidnik is Bella Grigorian from the University of Pittsburgh. Thank you so much, and welcome, Barbara.
Hi. First of all, thank you, Sasha, Ilya, and Anne for making this possible. And I have to say what a treat it is to be here and to see so many familiar faces for those of you who are showing your faces, and even for those of you who are not, to see your names. I hadn't realized that this would be, among other things, an incredibly fun reunion for me, who's been stuck in Boulder longer than I like. And the rest of you are probably stuck where you are longer than you like. So, thank you. This presentation today draws on my forthcoming book, or sections of my forthcoming book, Marriage, Household, and Home in Modern Russia, from Peter the Great to Putin. The book begins at the dawn of the 18th century and focusing on developments in the empire's largely agrarian Russian core, explores how the meanings and experiences of marriage, household, and home evolved over the course of 3 centuries of dramatic, sometimes wrenching, cultural and economic change. And also the ways that powerful institutions, church and state in the imperial period, the party state in the Soviet period, and now and once again, church and state, sought to shape all 3 according to particular priorities and visions of a proper social order. At the same time, the book examines the effects of historical developments on individuals and groups across the social spectrum, and the ways that particular individuals within particular circumstances responded. Perhaps taking advantage of new opportunities, perhaps simply struggling to survive in challenging times, sometimes adopting novel ways of constructing the self and intimate life, sometimes upholding or returning to longstanding practices and beliefs. The book draws on a growing body of scholarship, much of which has appeared since the collapse of the Soviet Union, on newly available primary sources and on my own publications and archival research. Extending over a 300-year period, the book pursues many arguments, but arrives at no overall conclusion. In my talk today, I take up one of those arguments, following a thread that runs through the first half of the book, while also demonstrating my approach within a relatively circumscribed temporal, social, and cultural framework. The argument concerns the culture of sensibility, and in particular, sentimental ideals concerning love, marriage, and the feeling self. Circulating initially among noble elites in the late 18th century, I argue, elements of the culture of sensibility over time trickled down, in scare quotes, in the process altering what some people of more humble background expected of their intimate and eventually public lives, even under circumstances poorly suited to those expectations. Sentimental ideas concerning love and marriage first made their way to Russia thanks to Peter the Great, who opened the door wide to Western European influences, and with his own second marriage to the future Catherine I, modeled a strikingly new attitude towards intimate life. In Peter's time, marriage making was governed by pragmatic, family, and clan-centered considerations across the social spectrum. In first marriages, at least, elders made decisions on behalf of the young, as had happened, in fact, to the 17-year-old Peter the Great himself before he was great. At this time, among the proper bases for marriage was emphatically not sexual attraction, The Russian Orthodox Church condemns sex enjoyed for its own sake as sinful. While spouses were supposed to love one another, this was an elevated kind of love, analogous to the, quote, spiritual love of the union between Christ and his church and between God and his children, end quote. A love that differed utterly from romantic love, a dangerous emotion best kept under control. Peter's second marriage defied these strictures. By choosing a wife solely to suit himself, a foreign woman of common birth whom he loved passionately and with whom he'd already had several children, Peter offered a new vision of marriage and what it meant to be husband and wife. An effective conjugal ideal that was disseminated in portraits of Peter, Catherine, and their children, depicted individually and as a family group. It was during, sorry about that, I'm getting hoarse. It was during the reign of Catherine the Great, however, that this new conjugal ideal first became broadly familiar to social elites. Catherine sought to create a decisive break with the values and morals of Russia's past, at least among that group, by transforming along Western European lines the ways that such people conceived of and conducted their lives. Her reign vastly increased the availability of foreign literature in the original languages as well as in translation, and saw the growing popularity of theater not only in major cities, but also in the countryside on the estates of wealthy magnates. Among the new ideas that began to circulate, those concerning intimate relations occupied a prominent place. Propounding the possibility of individual happiness on earth, the Enlightenment had rehabilitated the passions, including romantic love and sexual desire, as elements essential to such felicity. In the original or in the translation, literary works reflected the new trends, portraying marriage as the means to individual happiness and romantic and sexual love as marriage's sole justification. Such works introduce the idea that, quote, the force and extremity of feeling offered the most compelling evidence of love. Love lyrics and poetry reinforced these ideas. So did the Enlightenment stage. In theatrical performances attended not only by nobles, but also by merchants and townspeople, enlightened people agreed that a romantic union was the only basis for conjugal felicity. Portrayals of more forced marriage, by contrast, represented violence and tyranny. Significantly, such depictions privileged an individual's emotional inclinations over the needs and expectations of kin and community, which still govern marital alliances at every social level. Thereby, they promoted a right to self-expression and selfhood of a most fundamental sort. In that sense, romantic love is to modern subjectivity, as Dipesh Chakrabarty, among others, has suggested. The new ideas were particularly well suited for nobles who were better educated than other social groups and enjoyed privileges that others lacked. Sentimental ideas also coincided with greatly expanded opportunities for nobles with considerable means in particular, to enjoy domestic pleasures and duties. From 1762 onward, and for the first time since Peter the Great imposed his compulsory service requirement, men with the means and inclination could expend extended periods of time at home and from a relatively early age, at liberty to retire when they chose. The coincidence between ideas about domestic life and expanded opportunities to savor it was intentional, as John Randolph has argued, an element of Catherine's effort to refashion the Russian nobility. The influence on nobles of sentimental ideas concerning love and marriage is evident in memoirs, letters, and diaries from the second half of the 18th century onward. On the eve of his marriage in 1764, for example, Andrei Balatov wondered whether his marriage would make him happier. Happiness itself, of course, being a new expectation. Grigory Vinsky wrote of the pitched battles between my, quote, head and my heart, end quote, until he made up his mind about his choice of a bride in the 1780s. The poet and statesman Gavril Dzержavin, having initially married for love after his wife's death in 1794, married for love a second time, spurning, his memoirs emphasize, quote, the many wealthier, highly placed women, both widows and maidens, end quote, who made their interest in him clear. Influenced by the new intellectual currents, women too might not only anticipate conjugal felicity, but also experience deep disappointment if they fail to find it, although they exercised far less control over their intimate choices than men did. So important had sentimental ideals become to some noble sense of self that even when pragmatic considerations governed the arrangement of a match, as pragmatic considerations often did through the early 19th century, if not later, those very same people might nevertheless adopt the language of sentiment and may well have conceived their lives according to its terms. Marriages based on sentiment were facilitated by new courtship opportunities, which encouraged young noblemen and women to develop emotional attachments before they wed rather than after. This too was a legacy of Peter the Great's reign. The mixed sex gatherings he mandated in 1718 slowly but steadily gained popularity among nobles as the 18th century progressed. To find a bride in the 1760s, for example, Andrei Balatov had relied on friends, on visits to size up his various prospects, and finally on a matchmaker. 2 decades later, the growing popularity of balls and similar social occasions had transformed the marriage market for nobles of means. Thus, when his eldest daughter became marriageable at the age of 16 or 17, Balatov felt the need to travel with her to the provincial capital and even to Moscow, where balls had become frequent and where she might encounter a prospective suitor. To ensure that she and her brother could meet the requirements of the new sociability, Balatov hired an instructor to teach them both to dance. By the early 19th century, noble assemblies and gatherings where the young could court and dance had become commonplace. Unattached young people could also socialize freely at home and in the cultured world of high society, flirted with words in domestic albums. So far as I know, historians who study the impact of sentimental ideas have focused only on the nobility. Indeed, Andreas Schonli and Andrei Zorin have recently argued that noble elites were the only people to feel the full impact of sentimentalism and European culture more generally. The impact of European literature was more exclusive in Russia than elsewhere, they write. Quote, it provided a unifying and in parentheses, unifying paradigm for the educated public and at the same time reinforced the cultural and consequently social boundaries between the public and the rest of the population. The cultural gap between the noble elites and other urban groups reinforced the social divide between classes or estates as differences in language, appearance, habits, and beliefs became nearly insurmountable, end quote. Maybe so. But if by Europeanizing a privileged few, the culture of sentiment opened a cultural gap between the elite and the people, at the same time, it also provided tools to bridge that gap, if only in part, and eventually even to critique it. It created the possibility of a bridge, I argue, by making elite standing contingent on a person's behavior, values, ideals, and feelings, as well as, or even rather than, an individual's position in the social hierarchy or proximity to the ruler. And it did so at a time when economic and other changes, including the expansion of education, fostered new mobility too, even as the legal boundaries between nobles and everyone else became more difficult to overcome. It goes without saying that the vast majority of Russia's population, not only in the countryside, but in towns, remained entirely unaffected by these developments. But it is also the case that even in the late 18th century, elements of the new cultural currents had begun to reverberate beyond noble elites and further down the social ladder. Although how much further down that ladder and how broadly they resonated, it's really impossible to know. As my title suggests, my focus here is on men of the merchantry and their attitudes towards love, marriage, and the feeling self. But before turning to my subjects, I want to say a few words about merchant status as such, especially for you non-historians in the audience, because key features of it rendered efforts to realize sentimental ideas in practice far more problematic than was the case for nobles. To my mind, this makes such efforts all the more noteworthy. First and foremost, unlike nobles who gained their privileged status at birth, the privileged status of merchants, including their exemption from conscription and the head tax, depended entirely on their wealth. To belong to the first merchant guild required a minimum of 10,000 rubles capital, to the second, 1,000, and to the third, which would be abolished in the early 60s, 500 rubles. Subscription to in the merchant guild was collective. It encompassed a household, not an individual, so all members of a merchant household shared equally in its privileges and obligations, even as the head of the household governed them all. Merchant sons, as they were called in official documents rather than merchants, retained merchant status so long as they remained undivided from their father's household. On their own, however, to retain their privileged status, they required the necessary capital. Without it, merchant sons ceased to be merchant sons and became simple townsmen, subject to both conscription and the head tax. One consequence of this wealth-based status was significantly to enhance the practical, as opposed to sentimental, aspects of a marital alliance, a pragmatic approach being the longstanding one. In any case, what merchants usually look for in a prospective bride was the dowry first and foremost, but also, and the amount of capital it contained, which was enormously important at a time when sources of credit remained vanishingly few. Also important was a prospective bride's kinship networks and the extent to which they might foster a household's commercial endeavors. Another consequence of merchants' wealth-based status was to reinforce the legal authority of the head over the household, over the marriages of sons. According to Russian family law, whatever the age of offspring, even adult children required their parents' permission to marry, although if a son were performing state service, the permission of his superior took precedence over that of his parents. And I do stress parents here, mothers as well as fathers. Parents held the right to disinherit a son or a daughter who married against their will. In the case of merchant sons, disinheritance brought loss of privileged status unless a son had acquired sufficient capital to attain that status on his own. So to take one example, in the 1840s, when Ivan Rabusinsky, son of the successful Moscow merchant and old believer Mikhail Rabusinsky, quote, dared to choose a wife according to his own inclinations, end quote, he was cut off without a kopeck, as was his father's legal right. For these reasons and others, in his pioneering study, Merchants and Entrepreneurs in Imperial Russia, published in 1982, which seems forever ago, historians Alfred Reber emphasized merchants' profound conservatism as a group. Quote, the essential characteristics of merchant life were patriarchal authority, religious piety, and insecurity of status, he wrote, end quote, he wrote, placing special emphasis on patriarchy. Fathers taught sons the business and were reluctant to send sons to school. Families were self-contained and insular, which they found crucial to maintaining merchant ways. More recently, David Ransel's groundbreaking recreation of the life of the late 18th century merchant Ivan Tilchenov has in key respects challenged the picture that Reber presented. Ransel's book not only demonstrates the profound affection that developed between Tilchenov and his wife, their arranged marriage notwithstanding, but also, and much more importantly for my argument, the couple's openness to, indeed eagerness to embrace a lifestyle and tastes associated with the nobility. This included purchasing books, attending the theater together as a couple, and socializing with nobles in nobles' homes, as well as in the townhouse, complete with orangerie and gardens that the Tilchenovs built for themselves. In all these efforts, Ransel argues, the Tilchenovs were hardly unique among merchants. Even as Ransel's depiction challenges Reber in some ways, however, it upholds it in others by showing first the primacy of economic concerns in the making of merchant marriage, including that of the Tilchenovs, the role of elders in bringing those marriages about, and perhaps most importantly of all, the profound insecurity of merchant status, thanks to the difficult climate in which merchants operated. Indeed, Tilchenov's effort to recreate aspects of a noble lifestyle contributed to his eventual loss of privileged status. Tilchenov ended his life as a townsman. I turn now to how these larger circumstances affected love and marriage. In Tilchenov's case, love followed marriage. Indeed, Tilchenov does not even use that word. Ransel surmises his feelings from his actions. By contrast, love was very much on the minds of my three subjects, for better and for worse. The first is Ivan Ai Lapin, a merchant's son who presided over a shop that sold sundries in the town of Opochka, population under 6,000 at the close of the 19th century, in provincial Pskov. In 1817, when Lapin was 18 years old, he began keeping a diary, still a highly unusual practice for a person from his milieu, and all the more so because, unlike Tilchenov's diary, Lapin's focuses exclusively or almost exclusively on the author's inner life and intimate experiences, his emotions, his impressions of nature, the social occasions he attends, and the love affairs he conducts with various young women of his milieu. Literature was important to Lapin, a reader with an eclectic taste in books, judging by the diary. He exchanged books with others and commented on various works he read and enjoyed, including a work of Madame de Genlis, but also romances and a popular collection of humorous tales. His diary effuses about the beauties of nature and shows a taste for high-flown language. He is taken by a young lady's, quote, angelic smile, end quote, and enjoys the companionship of, quote, beautiful nymphs and end quote, and lovely nymphets, in quotes, as well as the incomparable Anyuta, one of a series of young women with whom he exchanged passionate kisses and fell in and out of love. Other tradesmen, petty civil servants, and non-commissioned officers accompanied Lapin on his rounds of various pleasures. He too hobnobs with his social superiors, although far less often than Turchenov. He mentions one occasion when he was a guest in the home of a wealthy nobleman and describes in some detail its furnishings. All this surely contributed to Lapin's sense of distinction, of superiority to the, quote, common people, he uses the term chorny narod, to whom he refers a couple of times in his diary. At the same time, Lapin's diary also suggests that the significance of sentiment and a heightened awareness of individual subjectivity might render such long-standing practices as marriages arranged by elders for pragmatic purposes more difficult for a person to endure. Thus, Lapin's adored Anyuta was, and I quote, horribly compelled, end quote, into an engagement with another man, and at the celebration shed, quote, the most bitter tears, end quote. The 17-year-old Nastya was similarly forced into marriage, in her case with a man of 40, quote, how much compulsion and weeping, end quote, the diarist exclaims. Lapin himself probably married unwillingly, or at the very least, not by his own choice, although he does not say so directly. He was, after all, a merchant's son, and thus still a member of his parents' household, and merchant sons who divide parents to marry by choice risk being disowned. In any case, with none of his customary effusions, Lapin's diary concludes with his own marriage at the age of 28 to a merchant daughter whose name appears in the diary for the first time. Thereafter, the editor tells us, the diary entirely lost its intimate and personal character and became simply an account book. My second example is based on a memoir rather than a diary. Penned by my subject's son, it lacks the immediacy of Lapin's account. I nevertheless include the story, that of the merchant's son, Alexander Laiken, because of Laiken's determination to marry on the basis of romantic love, despite his many pressing reasons to choose pragmatically, and because of his efforts to sustain his conjugal and family life, despite the potential financial advantage of doing otherwise. Alexander Laiken was born in 1806 to a merchant father who conducted a precarious haberdashery trade in the Gostiny Dvor in St. Petersburg. The father was already partially westernized. He was literate, had shaved his beard, and wore a frock coat rather than a kaftan. The latter two still quite unusual in this period. He was also a member of the German club, although I've yet to discover what this signified, and if anybody could tell me, I'd be grateful. His sons nourished a taste for books too. Alexander could quote lines from Pushkin and Lermontov by heart, and in the evenings, his family would read aloud together. Sometime in the 1830s, the date isn't clear, Alexander chose as his bride a young seamstress who had come to the family shop to purchase dressmaking material. Born a house serf, the future bride boasted neither a dowry nor influential or well-to-do relatives, indeed none of the advantages that merchant marriage was supposed to entail. It took a long time for Laiken to overcome the objections of his father to the match. That the father finally agreed is surely testimony to his relative liberalism, especially as the family business desperately needed an infusion of cash. Once married, the newlyweds followed the usual pattern. They settled in the household headed by Laiken's father and stepmother, where the husband's 3 unmarried brothers also dwelt. Thanks to the memoir of Laiken's son, we can follow the course of the marriage. Its history, which offers an unusually close look at the workings of a household in precarious economic circumstances, might also serve as an object lesson in the need for a pragmatic as opposed to a sentimental approach to marriage. Satisfactory as the young couple's match turned out to be emotionally, it gained the young couple, the household, neither the economic resources nor the kinship networks necessary to shore up its precarious finances. The bride contributed as she could, continuing to work after the marriage as before, now sewing christening shirts and caps that her husband sold at their shop. The money thus earned helped cover basic necessities, but fell far short of what was needed to maintain the family business, which had accrued debts and required an investment of capital. After the father's death, the three unmarried sons surrendered the shop to Alexander, the eldest son, but lacking sufficient means to finance it, and in a time when credit was virtually unobtainable, he was soon forced to sell. At that point, Laiken lost his status as a merchant and with his privileges, reverting to the status of townsman. For a time, he earned decent wages working as a clerk in the shop of a foreign merchant. Foreigners evidently not only paying far better than Russians, but also allowing their clerks to live where they chose. However, when he lost his position to his employer's son, Alexander's household, now including his children as well as his wife, embarked on troubled times. Virtually all Russian employers required their shop clerks to reside in the employer's household, and this would remain true right through the 19th century, which meant that clerks either had to remain single or to live separately from wife and children, and if they were peasants, those usually remained in the village. Unwilling to be separated from his family, Alexander was unable to find work. His household now consisted of his widowed stepmother, his wife and 6 children, an unmarried brother, and his wife's 16-year-old sister, whose freedom from serfdom Laiken had helped to purchase during his salaried days. Together, they suffered poverty, although never destitution. Alexander had no savings, only debts. Members of the household cut back on everything, going about with holes in their shoes. The parents even considered withdrawing their son from primary school so as to put him to work as a boy in someone's shop. As it was, the son managed to continue his studies during the household's straitened circumstances, only thanks to the support of one of his father's former colleagues. The boy was one of a, quote, astonishingly few, end quote, merchant offspring so educated, according to Alfred Reber. Living crowded together in an apartment, these 11 people survived for a while on the money Laiken's wife earned with her needle and what the unmarried brother contributed from his wages as a clerk in a foreign-owned shop. Only after Alexander succeeded in starting a wholesale business was he able to stand again on his own financial feet. And he managed this only because his stepmother, now elderly and senile, had hidden a substantial sum of money in her room, and he finally managed to extract 3 rubles from her as startup cash. My third and last example is the deeply religious third guild merchant, Pyotr Medvedev. My recreation of his story is based in part on a published section of his diary, which he began in 1854, and in part on historian Ai Kuprianov's extended analysis of the entire diary, which is housed in the historical archive of the city of Moscow, and which I think is probably an extraordinary document. Medvedev differs from my first 2 subjects in that, unlike them, he was not born into the merchantry, but rather fought his way into it. He was, in fact, a man of the, quote, silent majority, end quote, to use Kuprianov's language, the kind of person from whom the historian rarely hears. Born a peasant in the 1820s, he finally raised himself into the third guild, which is just the lowest level of the Moscow merchantry, after performing manual labor for years, at least some of that time, in a textile factory owned by his own mother. The labor left him, in his own words, ill-suited for commerce and with many character flaws. Quote, "My many years as a laborer, which required of me unconditional obedience and subordination in every step I took, weakened my character and inclined me to agree to things when in fact I knew better," end quote, he once wrote in his diary. That he kept a diary at all is unusual. Most diaries still derive from better educated individuals and or the nobility, whereas like most men of his background, Medvedev never received a formal education. Despite the lack of education, sentimental ideals of domestic and family life are central to Medvedev's account, even as his expectations of both were bitterly disappointed. The importance of those ideals likely reflect the new attention they were drawing across a range of media, fiction included, and also their role in the scenario of Tsar Alexander I. Whatever the source, it is clear that Medvedev longed for personal happiness, for a home that provided a refuge from the struggles of daily life, and for a wife that would preside over that home like a domestic angel. Quote, "Not a day passes when there isn't some unpleasantness at home, and how bitter that is, and what can I do about it?" Quote, Medvedev rhetorically inquired of his diary on May 14th, 1854. Medvedev's marriage was not a happy one, as the entries in his diary make abundantly clear. As marriages of the men of his milieu often were, his was based on calculation. 30 years of age, by his own lights, no longer young and still a townsman, he had chosen as his bride the daughter of a well-to-do merchant. Although in his diary he raged against his, quote, "senseless marriage," end quote, the marriage was in fact not senseless. He had hoped to use his bride's dowry and her family connections to raise himself up the social ladder, but the dowry amounted to less than he had anticipated, and he found himself, by his own account at least, saddled with a wife who was neither educated nor intelligent nor kind, with poor taste, stubborn, that is, who utterly lacked the angelic character and other qualities he had long dreamed of in a wife. Despite his humble origins and the pragmatism of his choice of bride, Medvedev, a reader, had come to share a sentimental view of marriage. His diary makes it clear that he longed for a romantic union of loving spouses and for a home that served as a quiet, cozy refuge from everyday cares, governed by the spouse's concerns for one another and their children's welfare. That is to say, a home that conformed to the ideals of the cult of domesticity. We know this because Medvedev's marriage and household met none of these criteria, to his unending grief. Not only had he chosen his bride for the wrong reasons, calculations, but his household proved anything but peaceful. For one thing, like the households of so many urbanites of his sort, not only of his time, but subsequently, Medvedev's household included others besides his nuclear family. In addition to himself and his wife, it consisted of his elderly but imperious mother and his widowed sister and her two sons. The household was rife with tensions. Mother and daughter-in-law got along so poorly that at times they came to blows. Husband and wife occasionally did too, especially in the early years of their marriage. In the milieu from which Medvedev derived, quote, instructing, end quote, a stubborn or obstreperous wife was regarded as a perfectly acceptable mode of behavior. Nevertheless, his own resort to violence upset the sentimental Medvedev, perhaps because his reading prompted him to expect better of himself, and it sometimes even sent him into a depression. In his diary, he complained frequently of the absence of sympathy and support at home, despite his very hard work on behalf of his household. Quote, "How bitter it is after all my labor and care, amidst the deprivations of our constrained circumstances, to encounter neither love nor gratitude, and in their place, perpetual insults in word and deed," end quote. Both husband and wife eventually sought solace from others, as Medvedev described in some detail. 2 or 3 years after his wedding, having failed to find love in his marriage, Medvedev evidently felt himself free to indulge his, quote, passions, end quote, elsewhere, if somewhat guiltily. What this entailed was engaging in casual sex with women, prostitutes mainly, and with working men, cabbies mostly, but not exclusively, usually in exchange for money, which is apparently not uncommon. To his diary, he confided the explicit details of these adventures. At the same time, Medvedev continued to have regular sexual congress with his wife, essential, in his view, to ensuring her fidelity. He even took a certain pride in his sexual performance. His wife nevertheless became sexually involved with someone else, his own sister's son, a member of their household. His wife's sexual involvement not only constituted infidelity, in the eyes of the Russian Orthodox Church, it also amounted to incest. His wife's sexual adventures might have provided Medvedev sufficient grounds for divorce, but the thought of divorce never seems to have entered his head. He certainly took no steps to explore the possibility, despite his perpetual complaints about his marital misery. Did he even know divorce was possible? Maybe not, as divorce remained exceedingly rare in Russian society, the result of efforts by the church to do everything possible to preserve rather than dissolve a marriage, even when the circumstances fully met its limited criteria. But even had he known of divorce, Medvedev's deep religiosity would very likely have restrained him from pursuing one. Because God, not mankind, governed human affairs in Medvedev's view, his wife represented a, quote, dreadful punishment, end quote, for his own sins, and thus a burden to be endured. Of these 3 stories, linked by sentimentalism and the search for love, it is that of the humbly born Medvedev that strikes me as the most suggestive, a kind of harbinger for the future. Demonstrating considerable self-awareness as well as a thirst for personal happiness, however ill-fated, Medvedev appears conscious of what Richard Sennett and Jonathan Cobb once called, quote, the hidden injuries of class, end quote. I have in mind, in particular, his awareness of his own habit of obedience, the product of long years of labor, which left him ill-suited for the very merchant status he had struggled and sacrificed at such cost to acquire. He appears to have developed a resentment of social injustice too, and not just as he himself experienced it. By contrast with Lapin, who was impressed by his visit to a wealthy noble and wrote condescendingly about the common people, Medvedev identified with the common people, Chorny Narod, and writing of his indignation at the way his social superiors treated him, he expressed himself in terms of we, not I. Quote, what should we do, we small fry, Mielechi, when our voice gets lost as if in a desert, end quote, he complained on one occasion. That form of selfhood and subjectivity, my book suggests, was a harbinger of things to come. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for that fascinating. Bala, we'll go to you for your discussion. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Barbara, for this really, really rich and stimulating paper and for this glimpse into your upcoming book, which I'm really eager to read now. I should also say that in addition to being grateful to the Jordan Center for continuing to support this venture, I'm really happy and grateful to Sarah Dickinson for running this lecture series so capably and so heroically, and also for suggesting this pairing. So thank you, Sarah. And you know, Barbara, it's really a treat and a pleasure to get to respond to your talk. So I have comments and questions in a couple of different areas. And you know, you're welcome to respond to whatever seems kind of most relevant or most interesting to you. First, since you discussed the spread of sentimental ideals about love and marriage as a phenomenon that affected the nobility first, and that appears to have then reached members of other soslovia, I was wondering about the sort of the vehicles for the transmission of these new modes of feeling. And so you mentioned reading, and you know, I wondered, I mean, I would love to hear more about what the merchants were reading and to what extent it's possible to determine this, and also what did reading mean to them? Also, how well did they read? How well did they navigate different kinds of reading materials? So for example, I think we would expect them to be good readers of religious literature, but what about secular life? Did they read periodicals? I found myself thinking about literary fiction, and particularly, you know, it's hard not to think about, say, Karamzin's Biedная Liza and its, you know, suggestive democratization of fine feelings, its announcement that, you know, peasant girls also know how to love. But I was thinking this was a momentous announcement for high society, for the educated public. What about for the middling segments? I was wondering also, I just happened to recently be working on Vainka Gain, and I thought, is this something they would have read? But in Vainka Gain gets married by force in a way, not due to love. So as you can see, I was very tempted to sort of try to construct a kind of alternative literary corpus that would have conveyed to them certain modes of feeling. You mentioned one of them recited Pushkin and Lermontov. How fascinating, right? Like, so I also wondered if they read domestic and conduct manuals. Some of which, of course, by the 30s were aimed at people in the middle stratum and people for whom membership in polite or educated society would have been very new and aspirational. So I wondered if there might have been any particular kinds of books like manuals that would have, in a way, helped them towards these new modes of feeling, these new modes of thinking. When you mentioned the domestic angel, and especially being familiar with your earlier work, I was thinking, okay, so are these ideals imported, and to what extent? And ultimately, I just found it fascinating that these people appear to be somewhere between the Mastroi and like Victorian middle class marital bliss, right? So, and that space in between those two poles seems very interesting to contemplate. And then what about writing? Do we know why they wrote? You mentioned Balatov, who, of course, unlike the merchants, I think, wrote really extensively, excessively, you know, like a graphomaniac. And as Thomas Newland has suggested, I think perceptively, Bolatov's prodigious output may have had something to do with a kind of lifelong search for an interlocutor, like for an addressee, for a community. And I was thinking about Bolatov's Жизнь и приключения and like the degree, you know, the scope of it, the degree of detail with which he recounts his life and adventures. I was thinking that all of this is suggestive of the value he places on the everyday experiences of a middling, if highly literate nobleman. And it's also suggestive of a degree of cultural isolation that he experienced, and I think that he hoped may be assuaged by writing more and by writing to a dear friend, as of course he addressed many of his works. So I wondered, what about the merchants? Can you tell us more about the kinds of diaristic or memoristic texts that they produced in terms of, like, I would love to hear about form, style, length. What has it been like for you to work with these texts, with these diaries? Is it possible to tell what writing meant to these individuals? What kind of value they placed on telling and on recording their lives? I especially love the example of the person whose diary becomes a book of accounts. And so I wondered, you know, like that seemed a really, really interesting example. And I wondered what writing meant to that person. Second, more briefly, in your previous work, you've participated in really impactful and generative ways in the ongoing conversation in Russian historiography about the Soslovia paradigm, and basically the usefulness of Soslovia as a conceptual category in studying Imperial Russia. And so I wanted to ask, you know, now, today, in the context of your most recent work, what does Soslovia mean to you? Like, I thought it would be interesting to ask you to reflect on the meanings of Soslovia, the usefulness of Soslovia. Is it more useful for the earlier imperial periods and perhaps less so for the later imperial periods when it begins to disintegrate? I was wondering how closely Soslovia is correlated to things like taste and cultural outlook. And I also wondered what sort of relation you would posit between the sociological or economic concepts like the middling classes, the cultural middle, or educated and polite society, and the legally defined concept of Soslovia. So I guess what I'm asking is, through what lens and by what principle would you have us organize Russian imperial society today? And then the last item, just your talk made me think of the novelist and lifelong bureaucrat Ivan Ganshirov. He was born into the merchantry, but I realize, of course, he didn't live his life as a member of the merchant Soslovia. But, you know, the talk got me thinking about kind of his experience of love and marriage and so forth. He never married. He formed an unusual household with the wife and children of his manservant after the manservant's death. He did this late in life, I think, out of a sense of responsibility that he felt towards his deceased manservant's household. In his younger middle age, in the 1840s and 50s, it's clear that Ganshirov navigated matters of sociability, marital kinship, and so on, with sophistication and a good understanding of the cultural codes in educated, polite society. In other words, he knew what love meant in 1850s Russia. He even kind of got to decide it, right, by writing about it. But I was thinking, I guess, about where to place Ganshirov. It's known that much of what he describes in the way of noble homes and noble lives in his novels actually appears to have its roots in the life and culture of his wealthy merchant family in Simbirsk. So I'm wondering about these spaces between Soslovia, I guess. I mean, because I'm a literature scholar, Ganshirov is the merchant I know best. And so I found myself wondering what, if anything, we might say about him, particularly as he's been called the closest thing to a typical West European middle-class intellectual that Imperial Russia produced. And so lastly, like, again, your talk made me think so much about middle things, you know, middling people, middling classes, and so on. I was thinking, as probably many people would be, of Pavel Fedotov's painting Svatavstvo Mayora, and the encounter that's dramatized there between a wealthy merchant home and the mayor who is looking to get married. This seems like a paradigmatic moment in Russian cultural history for the articulation, again, of that kind of new middle space, figured as a space that's social, that's economic, and that's also about feelings. So after your talk, it makes so much more sense to me that the painting is specifically Svatavstvo, that it's a scene that, however awkwardly, of course it's Fedotov, so of course it's going to be awkwardly, but nevertheless it uses matrimony, I think, as the space for the negotiation of a kind of Russian cultural middle in a way that's made to me much more legible and more compelling after hearing your wonderful talk. So thank you again so much for this really terrific talk. And that's really all I have.
Bella, thank you very much for those remarks, and we'll give Barbara a chance to respond, certainly, and then open up the floor. So Barbara, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Bella, for those stimulating questions, most of which I don't have answers to. I've read Balatov. I've got all 3 volumes. These guys are not Balatov. They don't, first of all, they don't start, their entries start with dates. They recount their actions and their inner experiences, but not in the same way. I'd have to think long and hard about stylistic differences in the way that they portray their own experiences. One of the things I would say is that the 2 diarists are much less concerned with social matters and much more concerned with their own inner experiences and the material world around them, the world of nature in the case of Lapin. I'm just making this up on the fly because I've never really thought about these things. And in the case of Medvedev, he lives in Moscow, and so he likes to go on excursions with his very large family, and he comments on the things they see in nature, sometimes religious shrines, and so he records what he sees. But Lapin is mostly concerned, apart from nature. He almost occasionally he will say, I went to market this Sunday, or after I closed my shop, I did this. He's shopkeeping. He's running a shop, and I assume it stays open till 5 or 6 or 7 or wherever late shops stayed open in the little town where he lived. He never talks about what happens in his shop. So they're much more there's less in them. And they're brief. I mean, Lapin's isn't very long. It's 25 pages. Balatov's goes on forever. What they read, I have no idea what the second 2 read. Nothing, not one word. Lapin talks about, he mentions a specific work by Madame de Genlis, which I learned from reading Gary Marker. She was published by provincial presses in the early 19th century. He has, I don't remember the title, there's one 18th century adventure tale that's very Russian. And a third thing, which escapes me, it's also Russian, has nothing to do with sentimentalism. And he mentions these because the books are discussed with others. He likes to talk, especially with his lady friends. One of his pastimes is to read things with his lady friend. Lady friend will give him a book. They will read it, and then he will talk about the fact that they discussed it. He won't say what they said. He will only talk about the fact that they discussed it. So these are much more less fulsome and much less revealing diaries, and that's about as much as I can tell you. And in the case of Medvedev, of course, what I'm reading is a fragment of the whole, so I can't even tell you what that's like. Although Kuprianov tells us about the diary, that it's something that's very, very interesting, and that might be interesting to you, which is that it's very filled with intimate sexual descriptions of his behavior. And Kuprianov hypothesizes, and I think he's right, that Medvedev's willingness to reveal these intimate experiences suggests a much thinner line between public and private than would be the case, for example, with Balatov. I mean, the one sexual thing that Balatov talks about, which is itself very interesting, is on his wedding night. Balatov is subject to the ritual that peasants were subject to. That is to say, the showing of the bloody marriage sheet. He doesn't really describe what happens, but he alludes to it, and he hates it. And it's the most interesting, intimate thing he says in the entire memoir, not in his wife's childbirth. But Medvedev is much more open about things like that. So that's what I can tell you. Soslovia and class, I have to say that I don't take this on. What I'm interested in is the migration of ideas and lifestyles across the diffusion of ideals and lifestyles across a varied spectrum of individuals and across a varied landscape. And I track those things, but I don't, and I always identify people by their soslovia. I mean, in some ways I'm indebted to the imperial pattern, which of course always tells you a soslovia of somebody. I'm very careful, as I am, in breaking the ties about the word middle or middling. And I don't think I can really, I don't feel confident answering that question, because it's not one of the questions I ask myself. What I would say to you is merely that a lifestyle that is associated with a kind of, I don't like the word, but I'm going to use it, bourgeois household, becomes more and more attractive across the social spectrum as the time proceeds. And in the book, there's one really interesting example, which I'm not talking about here, which comes from the memoir of I can't think of her name now, but a merchant, a woman who was born as a merchant. And she talks about how her mother tried to get rid of the shop clerks in her household so that they could have a simple family. And it's a really interesting example of the kind of ideal that's in the Russian case, I think, more associated with the nobility than anything else. But I'm not sure. I just can track the migration. I can track what people say about it, but I don't take on the big arguments. Okay, so I fudged all your questions, and see. So let's see who's else I can fudge as we continue.
I thought these were really helpful answers. I mean, thank you so much. In particular, actually, what you say, I also don't like saying bourgeois, but it's actually very helpful to hear you say it. So.
Great. We're open for questions. Ilya will be moderating, but I see that Nadia Kitsenko already has a hand up.
Yeah, I'm seeing a question from Christy Monet. I will please go ahead and unmute yourself to ask the question.
Oh, thank you, Barbara, for this this lovely presentation. I just had a very brief question. It's more of a curiosity, really. I was wondering, in the sort of broader scheme of your book project, past the imperial period and past the Soviet period, sort of what are you seeing, or what are you seeing in terms of sort of cults of domesticity in the contemporary Russian era? Because I know you reference, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, and sort of wanting to form a certain kind of noble subjectivity. Sort of what does this look like in the contemporary era under the current regime?
It's actually really interesting. There are three threads in this book, and they come to prominence in different ways in different periods. In the Soviet period, one of the most interesting threads is home. precisely because so very few people had one in the Soviet period. Everybody lived in a communal apartment except for the most privileged, and even though and for some even a communal apartment would have been luxury. And when in the Khrushchev period, people finally got apartments of their own, not everybody, but eventually over time, a more and more substantial proportion of the population got their own apartments. They were instructed at first that their home was not a castle. By the post-Soviet period, one of the fascinating things is people begin to make castles of their homes, completed. Those of you who were in the Soviet Russia after 1991, with fortified doors and all the rest of it. And so the cult of domesticity, which also had, I mean, it had reemerged in some Soviet style form in the 1930s, comes back in the post-Soviet period among those who can afford to have a wife at home, which of course is a very small sliver of the population. The cult of domesticity, in the sense of a wife at home, looking after the children, keeping house with a male breadwinner, is alive and well and stronger than it's ever been in Russian or Soviet history, I would argue. But only for the most narrow sector of the population. For most people, women work. I mean, they have no choice in the matter. But it has become a mark of social, of male achievement to keep an idle wife at home. So does that answer your question or not? And of course, Euro-style homes and all the rest of it.
Thank you. Next question, I'm going to unmute Nadezhda Kitsenko.
Thanks. Barbara, first and foremost, thank you for the compassion with which you describe the merchants. It's so nice to hear somebody talking about them without the nobles sneering or the clerical sneering or anyone else's sneering for that matter. So for that alone, bravo. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the religious texts that they read and the religious rites that they might have performed, because Ransel about Tolchonov goes on and on about how he's doing certain rites more because he's the burgomister and so on. But I wanted to ask you specifically, Galina Ulyanova recently wrote an article called, let me just check the title, «Автобиографические тексты купечества, религиозное сознание и религиозное поведение 1770 to 1860s». And one of the things that she talks about there is what kinds of things, not only that the merchants themselves read, but that their wives and mothers read, and basically reconstructs a textual universe, but based on religious texts. So do you see any traces of that in your guys? And if so, what? That kind of thing.
Alas, no. I mean, these texts are all, Medvedev is the only one of these three in whose account there's even a smattering of religion. There's none in Lapin. I mean, he mentions holidays. I think he occasionally mentions a priest, but religion is not a theme in his account, nor is it a theme in the secondhand account of my second narrator. In Medvedev's account, my answer is hampered by the fact that the published text is very short. I rely on it extensively, but it's short, and I'm dependent on Kuprianov's secondary account for much of my discussion of religion. So I cannot, so long story short, I can't answer your question. My sense is for the first two, it's just not there. For the third one, it may be there because he is religious. But that religiosity is something that I only have secondhand. I feel like I can't answer these questions as much as I would like to. And I wish I could give you more, but anyway, I can't. So, so there you are.
Thank you. I have a comment from Christine Royan. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Barbara. This is just fabulous. And what I like so much about what you're doing is you're complicating what we think we know about what happened in imperial society. And I think it's good to do that, particularly once we have these sort of rigid stereotypes like the merchantry, right? And we have to crack that open. And it seems to me that what you're doing in your work is incredibly valuable for that, but also for exploring this, as you call it, the migration of ideas, because that's a challenge for any historian to try to track. And I think you're doing a great job of it. Now, my specific comment is I can tell you the importance of the German club, why it's important. Because I forget which one it was. Was it Lapin? Was the haberdasher?
No, it's the second guy whose name, I'm having a senior moment here, whose name escapes me.
Laiken.
Laiken, right.
Okay. Most of the tailors were Germans. And so as the head of a haberdashery shop, he would want to be invited to the club to establish his network of contacts. And it sounds like some of them actually came through for him in the sense that he was able to keep his son in school. But I think that's the answer to that one.
Thank you.
Thank you for your lovely talk. It was great.
Thank you for that. I wish I'd known that.
I have a question from Kate Antonova. Please unmute yourself, Kate.
Hello. First, I just want to say how much I appreciate being with a group of people who can casually refer to the 60s or the 20s, and we all have the Russian 19th century in mind. I love it. My question for Barbara, and at risk of raising another issue where the silence of the archives is going to bite back at us, I was very interested in your mentions of material culture, particularly textiles, that this seems to be one of the other vehicles of the trickling down, or I think you used the word tools, which I really like, that people in the lower social classes could use to either adopt or even criticize the ideas of the elites. You meant the two examples you mentioned that I caught was really interesting to me, because the one was the one who wore the frock coat instead of the kaftan is sort of the one we expect. That's such a well-known trope of the difference, which side of the cultural gulf you're on. And then the other one you mentioned, which is much more unusual and kind of surprising, is the woman who is keeping her family together through her needlework, which fits in with some of the work I've been doing and what I've been reading from Ulyanova, who I also wanted to mention, about how significantly money was made even after the Industrial Revolution from needlework. That's something that I've been working on. So I wondered how much of this you're seeing, if it's something that comes up more in the book, or if it's one of these things that, like, those are the only two mentions, and what you thought about the difference between kind of what we expect and what signs we didn't expect.
Yeah, remember that the woman who does the needlework is actually a serf. She was a former serf. So so her work is in some ways not so surprising. In fact, in a different version of this talk, I cut it for time reasons. I was struck by the fact that Medvedev, despite his constant complaining about his need for money, never thinks of sending his wife out to work. Now, his wife is the daughter of a merchant, and a well-to-do merchant, so it may very well be that she couldn't do a thing with the needle. But no female member of his household, including the sister, his wife's sister, also bought from serfdom, so far as I know, is doing work. So, I'm confusing the two. Sorry. No member of Medvedev's household is expected to work. So, and I was going to say that I thought there might be a progression there. But I wasn't sure, because two examples do not a progression make. And so it's hard to, one of the problems of that is that it's hard to track those kinds of things. I know that in Breaking the Ties, I found examples of women doing needlework at home to sort of supplement the household income. And that's in the 70s, 1870s. So it certainly continued into the 1870s. I've found very little evidence here for this book, but that may be an artifact of the nature of my sources. It's because I'm not reading archival stuff for the most part. I'm reading published stuff, whereas in that book I was reading archival stuff. So it's so in other words, I don't know. This is my wordy way of saying, my wordy way of answering all these questions are elaborate ways of saying why I don't know, and that I don't know what I don't know. So thanks for the great question. By the way, your marriage plays a very, your study occupies a very prominent place in one of my chapters. So thank you.
Thank you. I have a question from Anna Berman. Anna, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you so much for the absolutely fantastic talk. I loved it. And I have a question for you. I have a really quick response to Bella, which is just that in Katrina Kelly's Refining Russia, she definitely suggests that the merchants are also reading all of these same conduct manuals, and that their lifestyle, that's one of the things she says about why they start to converge in terms of lifestyle with some of the gentry. My question, Barbara, had to do with domestic violence. And I guess it also follows up a little bit on Christie's linking past and present. I've, during the pandemic, gotten into the bad habit of watching some really trashy Russian TV stuff that's available on YouTube. And what's fascinating is how formulaic it is. These, I don't know, the seriali, melodrama, but they are always rich people who have the wife at home not working. That's very common. And there is a fair amount, though, of domestic violence. And I was thinking about, it comes up in one of your examples, and I was just curious, obviously your protagonist in that story is very uncomfortable with the fact that he's participating in this, but where do you see it and what patterns do we see? And I don't know how traceable it is, but that's my question.
It's a good question. And to answer it, I'm drawing less on this book and more on Breaking the Ties, where I have a whole chapter on this. And there I argue, and in this book, I refer to that argument without developing it in the same, to the same degree. But I argue there that one of the things that happens as a result of the culture of sensibility and the Charter of the Nobility is, which of course made violence against nobles out of order, was to make violence something that was to extend that sense that violence is not for nobles to noble women, and eventually down the social ladder, so that by the mid 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, violence against women becomes déclassé, if you will. It becomes something that is identified with the lower orders. And it's very clear in sources. One of the things that makes us noble is that we don't beat our wives. Now, that doesn't mean we don't beat our wives, but it does mean that it becomes a shameful thing. And I, in Breaking the Ties, I actually track that. So, and I don't want to do that here, but I forget which chapter it is, but you can see me doing it if you would like to read that. I will say here that one of the fascinating things for me about Medvedev is precisely that he takes that perspective on himself, and that he regrets his use of violence. He does it, but he feels very bad about it. And it's clear that he has drawn this into himself. Am I not answering your question? Unmute yourself.
Sorry, I didn't have permission to unmute. Thank you for I was curious how it tracks into the present in your last section when you get to
the last section.
Sorry, thank you.
The last section. That's harder because, I mean, I talk about I talk about the laws regarding domestic violence. I talk about the impossibility of knowing how often it occurs because it's not reported. There's no statistics. It is literally, you cannot ascertain how frequent it is. That it appears in shows, I have no idea whether that means it's frequent. Because there's a lot of violence, in literature, and it's just all over the place. And it's all over the place in part because it was forbidden in the Soviet period. You couldn't see it. So whether the fact that it's ubiquitous means it's ubiquitous, or whether it's just because all those taboos are now gone and we're having a great time depicting it, I don't know. And so I just say that we can't know. I do talk about the new law, which it makes it much harder to prosecute men for domestic violence, and I report some of the discussion about it. I have some figures on, I don't remember what they are, on how many women die a year at the hands of husbands or male lovers. But other than that, I don't know. We don't have those numbers, and I can't make them happen.
Thank you. No, that was helpful.
Okay, you're welcome. I tried.
Thank you. I have a question that Anne Lunsbury wrote out in the chat. I can read it. I have some small specific questions if there is time. When you say townsman, that's Posadsky, not Mещанин, right? Until what date did merchants have to pay to maintain merchant status? Did younger merchants' sons perhaps have more freedom to marry for love if their older brothers had married for practical reasons? And finally, when will your book be available?
The answer to number one is Mещанин.
Oh, okay.
And that's from Catherine the Great's urban city laws affecting urban life, the date of which I think it's 1785. And so it's Mещанин. Until the 1890s, in order to merchants had to pay to maintain merchant status to the end, but it became much easier in the 1890s to trade without becoming a merchant. And so the numbers of merchants, I don't remember the statistics, but the number of those who choose to remain merchants becomes quite small. And it becomes a sign of honor, voluntary participation. I actually don't know why people continued to do it after the 1890s, when there was little to gain from it, except some vestigial privileges. But the freedom to trade was opened up, and it greatly diminished the numbers.
Okay.
And did younger merchant sons perhaps have more freedom to marry for love? That's a really good question. And I actually don't know the answer. Very possibly they did. In fact, one of the interesting things about Ransel's book is he shows that although Turchenev's oldest son required the father's permission, essentially the father, who is much more westernized than his own father, more or less let the kid marry who he wished. So he was able to go his own way. And you can see that that trend within one household. And my book will be available on September 9th, 2021, 6 months from now, whatever that is.
I just want to say one more thing to follow up, and again, thank you for the talk, is that I'm preparing a new graduate seminar for the fall that's going to be about how what gets called the bourgeoisie usually signifies in different 19th century literary traditions. So what it means to talk about a bourgeois in France, a bourgeois in the British tradition, in Germany, and God help us, in Russia. So obviously it's not, the vocabulary is not the same. It's not a bourgeois everywhere. You have all these sort of very confusing, terms for middleness. But this, I think that this is going to help me a lot, because it's really about kind of, in most traditions, it's demonized. In the literary representation, it's demonized to some extent. Certainly in the French tradition, it's extremely demonized. The Flaubert's bourgeois, and what it stands for. To some extent in the Russian literary tradition as well, certainly. Less so, I'd say, in the German and British. But I think that it's going to be really hard to figure out how to teach the representation of the middle in the Russian tradition. And I'm really looking forward to your book. I know Kate's Antonova's book is also really helpful in this. So thank you very much for this work, and Bella's work too.
Thank you.
Great. I just wanted to remind everyone that if you have a question, please alert me or us in chat by just saying question. So far, I don't see anything.
Or Joseph Bradley has a question.
Didn't
he?
I'm sorry, what? Who?
Joseph Bradley? Was that Joseph Bradley?
Joseph Bradley, please, yes.
So thank you, Barbara, for a very stimulating talk and delivered with your customary engaging style. And I have a rather old-fashioned question, I guess, or an old-fashioned issue, and that is our old perennial Russia and the West. Are you finding mainly similarities in these habits and sentiments and so on that you're reading about in Russia with what's the similar ideas in Europe? Because you do say at the beginning that Peter sort of opened the door, and we all know that. One example that you gave of merchants who are very insecure, but of course that's pervasive in Europe and in America as well. That's the fear of ruin. Or are there moments when you are thinking of Russian distinctiveness or something that's preserved that's maybe still not like that in Europe? I don't know if it might be the very complex households that you mentioned in a couple of cases, or maybe something else. But this is very speculative, obviously, but I wonder if there are moments where you think of Russian distinctiveness.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I can answer it in part, and I can sort of take stabs at it in other parts. One of the differences, I think, is that Westernization and many of these lifestyles comes really from above. I mean, it's Peter the Great who imports this vision of marriage, literally, and then disseminates it. And of course, it's Catherine the Great who attempts to remold the nobility along Western European lines, which includes, of course, all the things that I've talked about and more. So the state initiative strikes me as one piece of this. It's not something that's homegrown. It's not something, I mean, it is eventually voluntary. And I think, although I would be hard put to demonstrate this, but my instinct is that that in Russia, these lifestyles and values take on meaning not only in themselves, but because of their association with an imagined West. And I'm not sure it's true to the same degree in the same way in those nations in which these ideas first originated, when they arose from homegrown circumstances. So this would be 18th, early 19th century. When we start looking at the trickling down, which raises other issues and the kinds of things I was talking about today, I don't know. It's an interesting question, and there's really no way that I can answer it satisfactory to myself, whether the people who adopt and appropriate lifestyles first first borrowed by the elites, whether they do it because it's foreign, because it's cultured, because it enables them to live in some ways in a noble way. I don't know enough to know whether that pattern of dissemination is comparable or different from the way things were disseminated in the West. I mean, one of the things that strikes me, of course, is a bourgeois lifestyle originates in the West with whatever the bourgeoisie is. It originates with the bourgeoisie. Russia doesn't have such a thing. And I never say that they do. I mean, in fact, I think somebody once said, even French don't like to talk about themselves as bourgeois. Russians hated the term, and it's always a term of opprobrium. I mean, you almost never encounter it in a source unless it's used negatively. So, and so there's a very complicated relationship with the very term bourgeois, even when employed by people whose lifestyle in some ways approximates it. So there's a complex history here, which make it impossible for me to answer your question, except with all these words, which are not in fact a satisfactory answer. Thanks, it's a great question. It's a great question. All of these were great questions. I keep saying, I can't answer. I should always say they're all really good questions and I appreciate them.
Thank you so much. I have a comment from Elizaveta Reichlina. Elizaveta, please unmute yourself.
Hi, so thank you so much for a fascinating talk. This discussion about terminology is kind of like, that's the thing, right? We have such difficulty using the word bourgeois, this sort of middle classness to describe what's happening in Russia in the 19th century. And I was just thinking about what Joseph Bradley said about the sort of merchant experience in Western Europe, perhaps in North America. And I think perhaps it would be more enlightening, more productive to compare perhaps merchant literatures, diaries, memoirs not in the West, but in Westernized places. So, you know, there is more talk recently of a global bourgeoisie, the idea of the bourgeoisie as being the sort of defining, globalizing force of the 19th century and everything that comes with that. So perhaps it would be instructive to compare, to take a look at merchants, you know, the lives of merchants that were written about in other non-Western contexts, and then to see how that compares to the Russian case, because they would be, again, you know, developing these ideas, not just as a sense of bourgeoisness, but in relation to the West. So there's this added layer that has to be taken into account. I wanted to also thank you for just a fascinating talk about behavior, about the migration of ideas, the development of a selfhood. I'm really excited about, you know, reading works like yours. I'm looking forward to the book that look at the merchantry in this new way, that sort of break our you know, fossilized ideas of what is the merchantry and what is the merchant experience. So that was just a comment about the talk itself. And I think it's very fruitful to look in the direction of behavior and personal experience, because the categories of terminology are just so tricky, and we won't really get anywhere unless we look at specific examples like these merchants that you're discussing. So one other comment, and it's about the German Club. So Nikolai Grech, who was a publisher, who was a journalist, who was also a German, he was part of the German Club in St. Petersburg. And in his memoirs, in his Zapiski, he writes, actually have it pulled up here, that this is where the bureaucrats, merchants, artists, craftsmen, and other such people of middle rank, Russians and foreigners, met and informed each other of everything they had heard and learned. So that's maybe, you know, a lead for you there on what is the German Club. I would also like to know more about its significance. It's clearly a site of sociability, and it has some influence in you know, St. Petersburg, and this is where your second example of the merchant Laiken, that's where it takes place. So just general comments. Thank you for your talk. It was a treat to hear it.
Thank you. I have nothing to say, except to say that my book is not about merchants. It is. Thank you for the German Club. I wish it's really wow. But the book it's not about any group. It's really about the migration of ideas and lifestyles and values. So, but yes, absolutely. And I mean, yeah, yes, and yes, yes.
Yes, yes to everything.
Analogies or developing world analogies, or whatever we call people in the westernizing world nowadays, I'm sure would be very, very interesting and revealing. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lively discussion in the chat, but no questions as far as I can see. So if anyone, Elise, I have a question from Elise Wirtschafter. Elise, please unmute yourself.
Hi, Barbara. I loved your talk. Thank you. And I think you're wise to stay away from trying to define all these categories. So, so one thing I wanted to suggest about where merchants may have gotten some of this sentiment or encountered it is the public theaters starting from the reign of Peter. You know, and merchants were part, I mean, all these urban, you know, there was this urban cultural milieu. I think that's part of what you're describing when you avoid the categorizations, the Soslovia categories. There is this urban environment, you know, and all this culture circulating and sentimental expressions, etc. So that's, I mean, there are a lot of plays that express these themes that, you know, regardless of what they read, they could have encountered it. My other question is one that shows my age and that I haven't kept up to date on this area, you know, that you work in as far as the historiography, but you're identifying the bourgeois sentiment or bourgeois domesticity already in the early 18th century. And for a time, at least, that type of sentimental affective attachment was associated with the bourgeoisie. So it was more of until we had the bourgeois domesticity of the 19th century, there was a suggestion that we didn't have that kind of sentiment. And I've always wondered, because, you know, there's so many literary examples of romantic love that precede the bourgeois domesticity. And so I just wonder how you deal with that, where the historiography is on that now, because clearly that earlier situating of romantic love in the bourgeois sphere doesn't really hold up, and you speak to that.
Good questions. First of all, let me say that I draw on your book, The Enlightenment Theater, a lot in the ideas that I emphasize in this talk and in the book. And that's one of my primary sources for those ideas, since I haven't read any of those plays. Secondly, and I was going to put this into the paper and I cut it because I was trying to thin it, is we we tend to conflate, and historians of women tend to conflate sentimentalism and domesticity. I actually think they're not the same thing, at least in the Russian case. It is true that in the 18th century, when we do get romantic love and marriage for love very strongly, there, to my knowledge, and at least you've read the plays and I have not, so correct me if I'm wrong, there's not a lot, except maybe about motherhood, which is also part of the Catherinian agenda. There's not a lot about housekeeping and all the rest of that stuff. It's only in the work by Diana Green, and also by Catriona Kelly to a lesser extent, suggests that the cult of domesticity does not really arise in terms of literary advice books and things like that until the 1830s. So in the Russian case, those two things that are often linked indissolubly seem not to have been linked indissolubly in the Russian case, partly, I would argue, because as Michelle Marisi has suggested, the way the nobles lived, they were impossible to fulfill because so many noble women were so active in estate management. And of course, Kate, is Kate still here? If Kate is here, I'll gesture to her book. Even if she isn't, I'm going to gesture to her book. I mean, she shows in an ordinary marriage exactly how domesticity doesn't work in the home of in the marriage of a real life couple. It doesn't work. So the cult of domesticity, while it is there from the 1830s onward, doesn't seem to be particularly powerful as a governing ideology until considerably later, judging just by what I've read. Certainly not for the nobles. As you yourself point out in your book on the estates long ago, I forget exactly what you said, but something like the cult of domesticity simply elevated what women were doing anyway. And so it was good for them. I forget your language, it was more eloquent than that, of course. And that may have been so, although my guess is that most women contributed economically by sewing or in other ways, more than we credit. Those things just aren't really remarked by historians. And that, so the cult of domesticity, it's being propagated, it is being followed. I argue in this book, as I do in Breaking the Ties, that it never sinks roots in Russia the same way it does in the West, for reasons that I don't know, but I don't think it's there, but it never becomes, to use a word I don't like very much, hegemonic, as it is in other settings.
So it's separate. It's separate from the romantic part.
Yes, it is separate. Certainly initially.
Different things. Yeah. Okay. That's not always clear, I guess, in some of the, maybe the historiography I'm more familiar with from way back when.
Yeah. I'll tell you, I mean, one of the really interesting things for me about writing this book, if people don't mind if I ramble on for another minute or two, I assume I have a couple of minutes here. I'm going to ramble, those of you who want to go. But one of the really interesting things for me about writing this book was that it's a lot about men. And all my work has been on women, as you know. And so it really required me to reorient my lens and do the kinds of things I've never done before. It's been a very interesting experience personally to do this. And it's only then that I began to see the disconnect between love and domesticity. Because these men marry for love. They don't expect their wives to stay at home. They don't. I mean, it's actually very interesting. And I hope to have an ongoing conversation with a friend of mine who's a US historian who was here for part of this talk and then fled. about this because I'm fascinated by the connection between sentimentalism and domesticity, which is treated certainly by historians of the US. If you Google, which I have now done, sentimentalism and domesticity, you will find that you will turn up hundreds of things by US writers about the United States, and almost nothing about any other country, a little bit of Germany, maybe one thing in France, but it's really the United States that has made that pairing.
Okay.
So I don't know what to do about that. Maybe there aren't so many women's historians exploring it in other settings, but it's certainly in the Russian context, to come back to your question, it just doesn't seem to be there until much later, and then not fully. So thank you. It's good to see you. Good to see all of you.
I think that on that extremely interesting note, we should probably wrap up. We're getting close to the end of our 2 hours. It's been a really, really fruitful discussion. And I want to thank both our speaker and our subsidnik and everyone who participated in the discussion. Thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you all at the next meeting of 19V.